myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. It feels alright.
Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. Big welcome to Ben Jacobs. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, how are you?
You've got a spring in your step this morning, mate. Leicester winning a game of football, mate. And what a result for you guys last night against Notts Forest.
Yeah, I was so happy that I got up this morning and then I was greeted by pouring rain that I've just come back in from, hence why I've got a winter jumper on. Also, by the way, I can tell you in the East Midlands or generally, you're never allowed to call them Notts Forest. So that's another thing to just point out. But it was a really good win by Leicester. Maddison obviously stealing the show. And I think that Harvey Barnes deserves a lot of credit as well for his performance in the game and his finish too. And the clean sheet, just an added bonus. I think that Nottingham Forest looked very toothless in front of goal, and Danny Ward didn't have a great deal to do. In fact, the opportunities that Forest created, really, they should have put away. But if you actually look at saves made by Ward, he didn't have to step in. There was one-on-one that I think probably would have been flagged for offside if the ball had ended up in the back of the net, and he parried it over to his left-hand side, and then the spin of the ball took it away from the Forest player. And effectively, had he hit it first time, and originally it was onside, they probably would have got a goal there. They obviously hit the post at 0-0 as well. And Ward did okay to kind of come out and narrow the angle. But generally, Leicester just did everything right. They just returned from the international break with a bit more zip, energy, hunger, balance. And the challenge for Leicester has been defensive, and against set pieces in particular, corners, they were undone against Brighton and Tottenham as well. And against Forest, when set pieces came in, they dealt with them with authority. And then at the other end, they showed what they can do. And this is a team really all season that have held the potential to get more points because they've been in front in games on a number of occasions. And on opening day, for example, they were brilliant in the first half against Brentford. They got a 2-0 lead, pegged back to 2-2. They were ahead at home against Southampton. They lost 2-1. They scored first against Tottenham and Brighton, and they ended up losing those games heavily. So this is an important win for Leicester, not only because they were back to themselves and they were devastating with the directness and the clinical nature that they came forwards with. But it was also just really important to get a lead and then kill the game off. So everything looking a lot better now for Leicester. The same can't be said for Forest, unfortunately. And although kind of people will, to some extent, smirk or laugh when I say that as a Leicester fan, if I take that out of the equation and speak as a journalist, I think it's great to have Forest and a club of their history in the Premier League. And I hope that Steve Cooper's given time. I know Rafa Benitez is being linked with that role, but when you make 23 new signings, of which 15 or so are core to their first team, I think you need to give the respect to a manager like Cooper and the time to let him turn things around. And if you bring in somebody like Benitez, I'm not sure that that's the right move at this stage of the season. But from a Leicester point of view, absolutely delighted.
Yeah, okay. I always put out a shout for questions when we're doing shows this early in the morning because our viewers tend to watch 6 o'clock onwards. But Mag Bry, well, come on, Ben, let's have it. Cards on the table. Is Maddison coming on in January? Albert, I'll ask the obvious question. Is Maddison coming to Newcastle in January? Steve Corbett, is Maddison coming to St James's next season? Newcastle Consortium supporters, of course, Keith. He goes, well, his nana took a job in Benwell Chippy and he's bought a house in Darrashore, so I imagine there's a good chance. And Darren Drinkles, who, of course, appears on the show on a Monday night, says, yeah, I would definitely have him. Lots of people asking the same question in the chat today. And John Askew says, will Maddison be harder to buy now after last night? I would say after the start of the season he's been immense. And if he does become available, will one game significantly increase his value? So what's your thoughts? We'll keep asking you this, Ben, about Maddison. What do you think?
yeah, we're going to get this, aren't we, between now and January? And I think that last question is the key point. It's not just one game, but as you rightly say, he's got 5 goals in 7 games, and nobody's been involved in more direct goals, either scoring or assists, than Maddison, other than Harry Kane. And that tells you absolutely everything. So if you go back all the way to May, you see a very consistent player who is leading by example and is scoring and is assisting and is a positive influence on and off the field, and just has that unique spark of creativity. So I think that the challenge Newcastle have is the better Maddison plays, the more chance of other suitors circling, and Tottenham have had a vague interest in Maddison without ever pursuing it. And there'll be other clubs in January potentially, or certainly the summer, that are looking for that creative spark. And the more consistent Maddison is over the course of 6 months or a full season, the more likely it is that some of the other clubs that have got European football will realise that this is a player that they should be seriously and actively pursuing. So then in the context of Newcastle, it's how fast and decisively they can move and how they can sell him the project. And my understanding from the summer is that he wasn't against a move to Newcastle, but he also wasn't entirely sold on a move to Newcastle. So the parts of Newcastle that he was in favour of was anything to progress. And he wasn't as pushy as Wesley Fofana about making it progress. But if a fee had been agreed, the parts that Maddison liked about Newcastle was the long-term ambition, was the unity in the dressing room, and was Eddie Howe. The parts that he was unconvinced about Newcastle was the immediacy of European football, and whether or not, if he waited, he could get a club that maybe already had Champions League football. So if Newcastle are to get Maddison in January and he's in this form, then they're going to have to be in a position where they're heading in the right direction, which is why their own win at the weekend is going to be important. And I think they're going to have to hope that other suitors don't enter the race, because the truth is, if Maddison doesn't sign a new deal at Leicester, then for lowest, I'd say 50 million, but highest 60, 65 million, including add-ons that you can be quite creative with, he becomes a bargain if his form continues across a whole season. And Leicester are in a really intriguing position, because they still believe that they can get Maddison to sign a new deal, and that deal may still allow him to leave in a year's time through a kind of gentleman's agreement, if you like. But the point of getting him to sign is protecting the value, and that value based on current form is only going to go up and up and up. So Newcastle, if they're going to get him in January, need to move fast. They need to work on this now. They need to get full player buy-in. And to do that, they need to keep the momentum of their last victory going, to suggest that they might get either European football this season, or that everything about the club, their other January signings, their future ambitions, their spending power, the package they can offer him, it's all moving towards a direction where the structure of the football club says this is going to be a team that gets European football week in, week out. Because Maddison's the kind of player otherwise that will say, you know what, if I just do a full season with Leicester and I'm the player of the season again, and I get double digits for goals and assists, then come the summer, a Tottenham's going to come after me, a Chelsea's going to come after me. And I think that's his feeling, that he's in good enough form. And if he gets that England call-up, of which I think he's fully deserving, then it will only, I think, add to his perception that if you can play for England whilst at Leicester in the relegation zone, and if you can score goals for fun and lead Leicester to a healthier position, then if he's patient, he can hold out for Champions League football next season. So that's the only thing really working against Newcastle United. He's fine moving up there. Howe is of big appeal, but it's about, first and foremost, somebody agreeing a fee with Leicester, and then Maddison will bide his time. He's not pushing for one move. He's saying, let the suitors come. And whether that's January or the summer, at that point, he'll decide what option he has and if there is imminent next season European football. So I think Newcastle have got some work to do, and I genuinely don't see Maddison rushing. And every time he plays a good game, it kind of works against Newcastle. at this point. And the same if he goes off to the World Cup, because it all just puts him in the shop window and it all just convinces other clubs to enter the race. So if I was Newcastle and I was serious still about James Maddison, I would do two things. Number one, I would focus on trying to get buy-in now before he potentially goes to a World Cup and before he has another month or so of being on fire. And therefore you're lining it up now, which is normal. It's probably what Dan Ashworth is doing anyway. But the second thing I would do, which I think is really key as Newcastle, is that like Chelsea, who are trying to line up Christopher and Nkunku, I would go against the strategy with Maddison as a rarity, and I would pay more. I would break the model and the mold. So Newcastle have been very prudent in the market of saying, we'll bid 45 for Maddison, but we're not going to give you 55 or 60. And they obviously did that with the agent fees with Ekitike. And there's been many other deals like Jack Harrison, where they've walked away because there's 15 or 20 million in terms of valuation that the clubs are apart. With Maddison, I think he is the difference in a side like Newcastle between January and May. If they're between 8th and 10th in the table come the halfway point of the season, if you add Maddison and his, let's say in the second half of the season, 5 to 7 goals, 5 to 7 assists, but also how he will allow Wilson and other players, Isaac, to shine and give them more space. If you add him in that second half of the season, that could be the difference between Newcastle hitting Europe this season and not. And in that context, it's worth that gamble of paying 10, 15 millions above the market value and meeting Leicester's asking price. So I think that it's quite finely balanced at the moment, but unfortunately from Newcastle's perspective, my personal opinion is the better Maddison plays, the more likely it is that a suitor London-based will come along that can offer him instant Champions League football, and that's why Newcastle need to move fast.
Maddison for England and going to the World Cup, Tom Dixon asks. Last one on him, I promise, folks.
I mean, Maddison deserves to be part of the England setup. And when you're this close to a World Cup, Gareth Southgate has locked in certain players and positions. And that can be quite irritating to both Maddison and a football fan, because we're seeing him now. And Southgate may have said, you know what? I've already decided who I want to take in those positions. And there is a lot of competition. But the simple answer is you've got a lot of players that are quite versatile, that can play in different systems and positions. And Maddison falls into that category. So who are we therefore comparing him to in terms of a like-for-like replacement? And I think the closest name in terms of style and position is Mason Mount. And at the moment, I would take Maddison over Mount all day long. Not because Mount doesn't offer an incredible amount, but because there's just a difference in form and game time. Mount is not playing week in, week out at the moment for Chelsea. He's not scoring week in, week out for Chelsea, and he's not offering the same level of assists week in, week out for Chelsea. And because a World Cup comes and goes and is ultimately more unpredictable, being a cup tournament, you want form players. So on the one hand, as England manager, you can decide who you want and you can bed them into the system, and you don't get much time with the players. So you lock in names that you trust. And that's been Gareth Southgate's approach. And on the other hand, you bring in players like Maddison and Tony also to the fold. I'm not saying that Tony should go to the World Cup, but I think it's ridiculous that you call him up and you don't even play him, because then you have no idea. So it's a really intriguing debate. But if you look at it statistically at the moment, you take Maddison. If you look at it in terms of versatility at the moment, you take Maddison. If you throw out the system, you take Maddison. And by throw out the system, I mean, does he have to replace Mount? He could replace Saka, who's a slightly more wider player, although Saka's in red hot form. So I'd no way suggest that you should drop Saka. I think he's one of the ones that definitely needs to go. He was brilliant off the bench against Germany. And that just illustrates the problem. As soon as you remove maybe Mount from the equation, where are you going to find the space to include Maddison? Because Foden's going, Saka's going. And I think that Southgate, to be honest, really likes Mount. And I can understand why. I'm just saying my personal opinion is I think Maddison is in better form. So then what if you look a bit deeper? Could you make an argument that we've got too many defenders in the squad for a back three? And the reason for, I think, Southgate's desire to take more defenders is because he may oscillate between a back three and a back four. But if Trent Alexander-Arnold is out of the fold, is there a logic in not taking a player either like him or in that position and instead bringing an extra versatile midfielder who can score goals and get assists? And I think you could make that argument as well. But again, Gareth Southgate may say he then becomes a little bit thin. And the advantage of Trent Alexander-Arnold or a player in that position is that they've got far more defensive qualities than somebody like James Maddison. I'm sure people in the chat will be laughing, talking about Trent Alexander-Arnold and defensive qualities in the same breath, but I'm not specifically talking about him. We all know that, unfortunately, at the moment, he's a little bit weak defensively, but he's still more accustomed to defending, if you like, in that position than James Maddison. Maddison, I don't think, could be utilised as a fullback. So it's an interesting debate. My personal opinion, again, to reiterate, is that it is a no-brainer at the moment to take Maddison to Qatar. The challenge Southgate has is he's got no more friendlies, he's got no more experimentation. So now if he brings Maddison into the fold, he's dragging him into the setup without using him in the last kind of friendlies. But the truth is that if Maddison has a good October and Mount doesn't play or score or assist, if he does play as often for Chelsea, it is going to be very, very difficult in 4 weeks' time as Southgate comes to name his squad to pick Mount over Maddison, because Maddison is doing everything at the moment. And the final thing that I would say, because I was listening on Sky, is I think it's really poor to, in an unsubstantiated way, reference the fact that something working against Maddison is that he doesn't, quote, travel well. And I respect Gary Neville, and I totally appreciate that Gary Neville is not inventing that. He's read it somewhere, he's taken it from somewhere. But it's not something I've seen to any great degree. And Maddison, as you see when you hear him speak off the field, which is a massive asset, is eloquent, is honest. He's a great lad. I've come across him, dealt with him as a journalist many times. He's open, he's respectful, and he's never afraid, win or lose, to talk to people and give his opinion. And that bleeds into the dressing room, where he increasingly is an influence and a leader. So to suggest, when it's anybody's dream to go to a World Cup, that if he made the squad but was a bit part player, he would be disruptive, his ego somehow would get in the way, is just a slight on him as a professional. And it's the opposite of everything he's done since joining Leicester to move away from that tag. So whereas it may be absolutely true when he first joined Leicester and previously at Norwich City, there was a swagger about him that played slightly into the stereotype off the field of footballers that kind of thought that they had everything in the world. And perhaps as a personality, it created an attitude that was detrimental in the early part of the career towards being a team player and towards putting others above the individual. So therefore, Maddison was originally a little bit selfish in the way that he played football. But he's worked under managers, and as soon as he hit his kind of early 20s, he's become the exact opposite. He's become a maturer, selflesser player with the same swagger on the football field. And off the football field, he remains a fantastic professional and individual. So to even suggest, without knowing the guy, that calling him up would damage a dressing room or would create friction is absolutely ridiculous. I can guarantee you, if Maddison went to the World Cup and didn't play a single game, he would still be brilliant for England, because off the field, he would create unity and his personality would be welcome. So I don't know where that angle has come from. I don't know where that suggestion has come from. But what I would say is that if Gareth Southgate, in a marginal decision, factored that in, he couldn't be more wrong, because James Maddison would be a fantastic addition to the England squad on and off the field.
I agree, mate. I agree. John Askew says, lads, why is there a reluctance for clubs to release details of player injuries? Toon fans were hoping Anderson would start against Bournemouth, but he was apparently injured. But nothing was confirmed. Is it primarily to keep opposition teams in the dark? I would say it is, Ben, isn't it? Nobody plays poker and shows everybody their cards, do they?
Yeah, it can be down to not wanting the opposition to know, because they'll have practiced all week in a certain way. especially if it's a flagship player. Imagine Manchester City and Haaland, and everyone's thinking, how do we stop Haaland? And you know that Haaland's injured and isn't going to play. You're not going to say that because you come up with plans. And then when the team sheet comes out, you take everybody by surprise. So it's tactical in that respect. Then sometimes you have a situation where the nature of the injury is unclear and there might be an outside chance of the player making the match. So you don't want to reveal anything until you know. There can be late fitness tests the day before a game or on the day of a game. And that's another reason why you keep things quiet, because you genuinely don't know at that point. And then sometimes you keep an injury quiet because you want to kind of protect the actual player. And the severity of the injury may either be unknown or may be serious. And until you've done further tests and until you've got something kind of positive to say, or until you've got something accurate to say about the length of time out, you also don't want to reveal it. So it's totally normal. And then the final thing is just, how has the injury actually occurred? So if it's in a match and everybody can see it, then you tend to be more open about it because everyone's seen it happen. So if your player's gone off writhing in pain on a stretcher and it's a suspected broken leg, then that's gone live to millions, and then the manager will be asked about it, and you kind of have a responsibility to update because you can't hide it. But if it's a knock in training, you also might want to keep it quiet because you don't want to go into too much detail. One, about how it happened, and two, about how severe it is. And that's also perfectly normal. And that is just the divide in football, that what occurs in training stays behind closed doors, good and bad. And that's for tactical reasons, that's for personal reasons. And in the case of an injury, it can be down to severity reasons as well. But if it's more open and in a match, you've got absolutely no choice but to reveal things because it's just there in plain daylight for everybody to see. So those are the kind of reasons. But yes, the main one, especially if it's just like a knock, if a player's 50-50, for not saying anything in advance where you possibly can, is just to throw your opposition off. So then they become surprised by your team sheet, or they have to plan tactically for two different eventualities.
Ian Toon Trader, good morning. He says, do you think if Garan Kual is selected and plays a part in the group games for Australia, he could qualify for a work permit without going out on loan, Ben?
I think that's going to be difficult. So the plan is that he needs high level European football. And to get that, he'll have to play with more of a longevity than just a few group games for his country. But Newcastle are in no rush here, and that's the main point. So if he consistently over a longer period of time plays for his country, then that will be different. But the plan will to be safer with this, because you can't guarantee international selection, especially if you're not getting regular domestic game time. So regardless of whether or not a work permit in the longer run could be got strictly and solely through international football, he will still need game time in the short term at a higher band and level than he had in Australia. So Newcastle will therefore be seeking a plan and pathways. And we discussed this, didn't we, on the last show, and how the advantage of that multi-club model that the City Group have got, that Red Bull have got, that Chelsea are planning, and that other clubs are looking at. And this, I think, is why PIF will eventually follow that model in the context of Newcastle, is that you have ready-made clubs. And those clubs, if you own them, you've got control over. And that's not to say that if you send someone to a club within your group, they, as per the deal, have to play. There will never be an obligation that forces the manager to play them. But once you own the club, you control the training facilities, the level of coaching, you can access the data, so you can really get a sense of the player's development that you can't if you just send off to a random club that you've got no say or control over. And this is why I think multi-club model for Newcastle will end up being their future and their strategy as and when they stabilise and start to get regular European football. So the aim now is just to build Newcastle so they become closer to the top of the pyramid. Once they're there and they're consistently qualifying for European football, if that eventuality materialises, you can look to buy around Newcastle because you've kind of raised Newcastle somewhere close to the top of the domestic pyramid. But I think the short answer is he won't get enough points and enough games only relying on playing for Australia, but you also won't get the guarantee that he'll always be selected if you go down that line. And that's why Newcastle need to get him a club in Europe with more regular football.
You don't do short answers, Ben. I've got to be honest. There's lots of chat about the jumper again, Ben. You did say you've got the jumper on. You've been caught in the rain this morning. You've come in. You've put your winter jumper on. John's suggesting that you at some point when that has to go to the jumper heaven in the sky, that you maybe put it out for the food bank.
I mean, we could. It's a rare Zara concoction that doesn't exist anymore. So I might be the only one that actually owns it. And we can auction it off for charity at some point, but only, I think, during the summer, because this is going to prove very valuable to me between now and March.
Yes, I would agree, mate. I would agree. Okay, I'm going to do the ads, give you 5 minutes off, which is my chance to say thank you to the sponsors. Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com. The website, skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay as you go waste collection. Thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals, independent funeral directors, with us for another month. 304 Old Durham Road, Gateshead, telephone 0191 478 2730, website darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Thanks to Garden of Healing Dispensary, based on Nunn Street in Newcastle, CBD hemp and cannabinoid specialists. You can find them at thegohd.com. And thanks to Matty Patterson and the lads again for keeping on board with us. We're going to have Matty on the show tomorrow night. 3 Property is where you want to go. 07966 871 993, or email phil@3property.co.uk. Great bunch of lads. I'm going to have Matty on the show tomorrow night talking in depth about Newcastle, but of course about that business as well. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's hot sauces, handmade in Cumbria. The countdown is on at the takeover party on Friday. Me, Steve Hasty, and the lads will be tasting these on camera. And you can find them at mrvickies.co.uk, or give them a call to order on 01768 210 102. Big welcome to Blowhole Brewery, and you can find them at blowholebrewery.co.uk. Now, those eagle-eyed viewers will notice that the beers are designed in former Newcastle United strips, some of our favourite strips. You've got Dirty D there, Berry Blonde, Geordie Juice, but the black and white there as well, prominent, fantastic idea. And the guys from Spider VPN have come up with those beers. So get yourself onto the website. I've stuck it in the chat if you enjoy your beers. Thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the video side, technology side of things. They always do our videos for the start and end of the show, and our little quirky ones that we use on some shows as well. Thanks to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Walls and Newcastle, and the guys who run our website, NUFCmatters.com. If you want to subscribe to the show, then hit the little logo down in the bottom right hand corner. You can subscribe for free. We do 7 shows a week, and it is all NUFC content these days on this channel. Hit the thumb up under the video to like the video, and share to your social media. It does us a big favor. We're also available as a podcast on iTunes and Spotify and other podcast providers. If you want to help us, you can join by clicking join on YouTube and make a small donation each month, which helps us towards running costs, etc., because there are a few when you do these shows. Or you can spend a one-off fee of £25 by going to the website and checking membership out. £25, what do you get for your money? One-off payment, you get a cup, a pen, a membership card and a scarf, and entry into the monthly draw. Well worth £25 of anybody's money. And you can also use the QR code, which will take you straight there. If you want something for free, well, we do give away a free car window sticker if you subscribe, but you must email john@nufcmatters.com to claim your car sticker today. We do support the food bank massively on this show. NUFC fans, foodbank.co.uk is the match day bucket, which is virtual. You can make a donation there any time of the year. And we also do T-shirts on a Friday. This week's T-shirt is going to be signed by Alan Shearer, Premier League's top goal scorer, Match of the Day presenter, and he will be signing that T-shirt. So get yourself onto my Twitter, @SteveWraith, give me a follow, and then bid underneath the pinned tweet. The Shearer shirt, I'm sure, will make a lot of money. Last week's Beardsley shirt still blows me away. Made £520 for the food bank. That's a hell of a lot of money and saving a lot of people a lot of distress over the coming weeks. Peter Beardsley, as you know, big fan of the show, and we are a big fan of his. He has got his October half-term soccer school, and he's taken bookings for Monday the 24th to Friday the 28th of October. It'll be 10 till 3 at the Fox Hunters Pavilion. PeterBeardsleySoccerSchool.com is where you can find out information for that. And he does Monday night training as well on the 26th of October. Peter Beardsley Soccer School for that as well. And last but by no means least, on the Peter Beardsley front, with regards to what he is up to, there's a Legends game going on. Newcastle Legends game, taking on a Manchester All-Stars team. And John from QTech is putting this together in aid of the food bank. It's Friday, October the 14th. Adult admission is a £5, 7 till 9:30, and junior admission is £2, 7 till 9:30 for the game. Admission and talk-in, adult only, 7 till 11:30, and tickets are available from NUFCmatters.com. And tickets have gone through the roof since young Adam Pearson was announced. No surprise there. He is certainly creating a lot of waves on the Newcastle United front. Great kid as well. Like him a lot, but he has agreed to play in the game. And that is, I'm pleased to say, bringing in lots of sales for the food bank. Finally, an evening with Peter Beardsley, a Christmas present idea at St. Dominic's Catholic Club in Byker. Friday the 10th of February, £22 a ticket. That's a bargain. I've pinned the link in the chat if you want to get yourself along to that. And NUFCmatters.com are also doing one on Friday, February the 17th. And that is tickets available for that at the Irish Centre and NUFCmatters.com. Don't forget, games at the weekend mean that Super Matt will be at the Dog and Parrot at 12:30 pre-match and 6:30 post-match. And John Anderson and John Gibson will be at Pumphrey's pre-match only at 12:30. And those of you who do like the true crime content that I do, well, we have a new channel. The True Crime channel is now set up on YouTube. A lot of the stuff getting migrated over to that channel that we've had on here for many a long time. But we do listen to what people say. People have said we don't, some people don't like the true crime content. So no problem. We've moved it onto a different channel. There'll be no more of that on here. It's NUFC and NUFC only. Lastly, Ross Gregory is joining me tonight. A little bit of confusion whether he would make it because he's in London at this present time. But he says he will be back in Newcastle at 5, and he missed the show, of course, last week with COVID. But he is fully fit and ready and raring for a return. So we will say 6 till 7. We've got to rely on him getting back on a train. It might be slightly later. But yeah, Ross is booked in now for 6 till 7 tonight. So please join us for that. Okay, let's get back to the questions. Lots of people asking lots of questions, which are very similar. So I do really want to try and find stuff which is a little bit different. Alan says, surely, Ben, when we play Leicester on Boxing Day, we get him drunk, get him to sign it on the night and pretending it's just an autograph we want. Yeah, you talk about that jump, that's causing a lot of controversy. Roger Cook, there's something different. Ben, any info about the mentioned Portuguese keeper? Yeah, it has been mentioned that Newcastle could be going in for another goalkeeper at some point. But again, transfer stories are going to start to circulate, but they're starting to circulate now. Maddison has never gone away since the summer. But any news about goalkeepers for Newcastle or any other player, Ben, that you'd maybe picked up on your journeys around, different press rooms?
So the Portuguese goalkeeper, I presume you're asking about, is Diogo Costa, who is Porto's number 1. And this, I think, doesn't have too much substance to it because naturally Nick Pope has been brought in as the number 1. And my understanding is that Costa won't leave as a number 2, even though he's young and could obviously assume a number 1 position over the course of the coming years. But he's playing Champions League football. He is also being selected for his country, which would make signing him for either competition on a like-for-like level with Pope or as an understudy to Pope very problematic. He will only join if he is a number 1 at either a Premier League club or from the many interested parties. So Manchester United are also looking, and they view him as a long-term number 1, and Leverkusen and Ajax, and as I understand it, Inter and Lazio in Serie A have also made inquiries. So there is some truth that Newcastle have looked at the player, but you have to kind of consider a few things here. Number one is that Newcastle's valuation of Costa, having first looked at him, as I understand it, over the summer, was around about 20 million. And if they were to bid in January and bring in a young goalkeeper, then they might put together a slightly higher offer, but still only about half the release clause, which, as I understand it, is about 50 million quid. So you're not going to get a deal done for that, because you're talking about a 23-year-old. He's the number one goalkeeper at the club. He lets in, on average, less than a goal a game. He is playing Champions League football. And when you look at the potential based upon his style, he's everything you want in a goalkeeper if he continues to develop. He's about 6'4", excellent shot stopper. And the most pleasing, I suppose, quality to Premier League clubs is that he's got tremendous maturity and command over his box for someone that's such a young age. And he can come out of it as well and play sort of like sweeper keeper too, which may be of appeal tactically to a number of different clubs. So all of that suggests that he would be an excellent target. So I'm certainly not discounting Newcastle being interested, but you have to think about where does he fit at the moment in the side and comparative to other offers. So there'll be teams saying to him, if you join us now, we'll give you European football and you'll be our number one. If Newcastle sign him in January, does he supplant Nick Pope? I highly doubt it. And that's the problem. And then number two is that the fee is just nowhere near how you're going to get a deal done. And that, I think, is going to take Newcastle out of the equation. So we said before with Maddison that he's a player worth paying that 10 or 15 million more in order to actually get him now, because he could be transformative. But with Costa, Newcastle don't need that instant transformation. It wouldn't be worth their while paying the release clause of over 50 million or around 50 million anyway, because Nick Pope is the number one goalkeeper, and I don't see that changing in the short term, which is why I don't think there's too much to get excited about here. In terms of other players, I think that you've still got Pulisic on the radar for Newcastle, and if they don't get Maddison, or it's just not possible, that's one to watch. At the moment, I think that Pulisic after the World Cup could be considered to go somewhere, but the Graham Potter factor is going to be the part of this narrative that makes it a bit more unpredictable. So if we were back with Tuchel as manager, then I think Newcastle could plan, especially with their relationship with Chelsea's owners, to try and get Pulisic in some capacity, probably on a loan, but with an option to buy, because he just wants the game time and he wasn't happy under Tuchel. But I think that with Potter, that makes things a bit more unpredictable, but it's still one to watch. The only caveat I would add to that is if a Serie A club, and Juventus in particular, make an offer, that is Pulisic's preference, as I understand it. So he's already spoken to Weston McKennie about how he would like to link up with him at Juventus. And when Tuchel was still at Chelsea, they held conversations about what it was like to live in Turin and so on, because at that point early in the window, Juventus were considering a loan move, but it never materialized. And Juve are not in the race at the moment. They've decided against Christian Pulisic, but that may change in January. So let's wait and see off the back of the World Cup, which is Pulisic's priority. But he is one to loosely be keeping an eye on. And the same can be said for Jack Harrison as well, who obviously Newcastle were interested in. And there was just a gulf in valuation between Leeds United and Newcastle. But let's see if they revisit that in January. And still the final name to think about, all in the same, loosely speaking, position. Some are on the left, some are on the right, some are more versatile, some can play in multiple positions. But if you look at all these names, beyond obviously the goalkeeper, they're all creative-minded players. They're all attack-minded players. They're all versatile-minded players. They can all start wide and cut inside. They can all play as number 8s potentially, or certainly number 10s in a more central capacity if they give them more freedom. So it's clear that Eddie Howe wants that creative spark, but with a bit more versatility, And that's going to give him tactical options. That's going to give him game management options. So even though some are on the left, some are on the right, some have got assists as their strengths, some have got goals as their strengths, some are the complete package, some like Maddison can float much more centrally. There's definitely more of a pattern to what Newcastle are looking for in the January market. And it's basically that one position that they arguably missed out on over the summer window. And to that point, the other name to consider is Mykhailo Mudryk, and Newcastle are definitely interested as well. Mudryk is on record speaking to me as saying that he couldn't say no to Arsenal. Leverkusen have agreed a deal for him in the past, and then they kind of got messed around by Shakhtar. But this is a player that's scoring for fun in the Champions League and assisting as well. Nobody's got more combined goal contributions, assists and goals than Mudryk in the Champions League so far. So he's in red hot form, and Shakhtar will want at least, and I stress at least, 50 million euros. Everton in the last window bid 30 million euros, and it was flatly rejected. Arsenal and Brentford have circled without really making tangible offers because they were put off by the asking price. But let's see whether Newcastle move there as well. They are in the race in the sense that they are monitoring the player, but they have not actually made any significant approach to date. But if he keeps scoring, that will be one to watch in January as well.
Okay, good stuff. Ben, are you, like many, irritated that the season stops for the World Cup?
Not really. I mean, from a fan point of view, the season doesn't really stop because we can get behind England. And if you're of another nationality, it's exactly the same. It's probably irritating if you're an Italian, for example, but a lot of the other European leagues have this winter break anyway. So if we're narrowing down who might be irritated, we're essentially saying somebody that follows a Premier League club and is perhaps not English. They're the ones that are not going to get any football. If you fall into any other category, your league either has a break if you're a major European league, or obviously if you're in England and you don't like the break and you're English, you can still get behind the English team, and there'll be other people with other countries that are at the World Cup that can do exactly the same thing. And I think it's the right approach. There needs to be a break at some point in the season. I like the festive calendar. So if you're going to have a break, you could either have it shortly before or shortly afterwards. But I don't mind if football stops for 2 or 3 weeks to allow rest and recuperation. I think that that is probably the future of the game. So the irritability is probably historical around can a nation bid for a summer World Cup and then just move it to a winter World Cup. And the other thing that I think is slightly irritating is just for the first one, how we've had to force, COVID has part of the sort of reason why this has knocked on all of these fixtures into such a congested period. So, you know, if you plan for a Winter World Cup and we've had plenty of time, then if that then doesn't become a Winter World Cup over the course of the next few World Cups, but that gap becomes a break instead of a World Cup, then you need to transition into that to make sure that the season starts and is spread out in a way that doesn't give us this current October. Because that's what I don't like, that you got all these players planning for a World Cup, but they've got much higher chances of potentially getting burnout or injury because the fixture calendar is so crazily congested in the month of October and into early November before the break. So that's a bit unfortunate because it might damage both club and country, and we might get more players that end up out of a World Cup, unfortunately, because they're picking up more injuries. But I have no problem with the Winter World Cup specifically now, not on a practical level. Again, I come back to what I said before, on a moral level, should they have been allowed to bid for one World Cup in summer heat and then change it to the winter? But for balance, the Qatar committee have always argued that they could have staged it in the summer, and they've got the technology and the air conditioning, cooling in outdoor venues to be able to facilitate it. But naturally, you've got fans there in extreme heat still that wouldn't want that. So you've got to factor in safety away from just the football. So I think that morally, there's still that argument, but we're too late in the day now to change anything, unfortunately. But cut, because it basically goes into a slot where I think in the long run, we will be looking for a break anyway to protect player safety and welfare. And I think that ability to recharge is very strong. But when you have the break is key. So for me, I would run into the festive period, then after the festive period, probably after Boxing Day, maybe after New Year's Day games, whenever they take place, usually on the 2nd or the 3rd of January, then I would take the break for 2 weeks or even 3 weeks. And the reason for that is because then it becomes like the summer, doesn't it? You have the ability to sign new players and have 3 weeks to work with them, or 2 weeks as a minimum. And then when you return, not only are you more cohesive and you've bedded people in, but the window's almost shut. So you don't get this high volume of fixtures at the same time as you're trying to do business for the January market and having to throw a new signing straight into the thick of it without any time to get to know them. So I think it makes a lot of sense, but obviously there's some logistical aspects as to when that break might take place, but there's no irritation at all from my point of view. And I'm busier than ever during the Qatar World Cup. And from a fan point of view, you've still got your football and you've got the excitement of the World Cup.
Yeah. Quick one on this. Brian says, do you think Brendan Rodgers would have been sacked if they'd lost last night? And
no,
would what, 3 games?
Yeah, I was always told it was 3 games that he had been given to turn things around. So in that context, it's important to note, despite the manner and the positivity of the win last night, that in theory, if Leicester stick to their plan, then after the game against Forest, Leicester will have to get something from Bournemouth away and then Crystal Palace at home. Were they to lose those 2 games, then if the board stick to their original plan, as I understand it, then they still may make a managerial change. But things also are altered in football by momentum and by kind of one-offs that you don't anticipate. So if you got a kind of ultimatum presented, if you like, it wasn't that strong, by the way, but if the board in their own head say we want minimum 6 points from Forest, from Bournemouth and from Crystal Palace, if you got a 1-0 turgid win against Forest and then you lost to Bournemouth and lost to Palace, then you, in all likelihood, sack Brendan Rodgers. But now, because they beat Forest so emphatically and with such a feel-good factor, that might throw out the window this 3-game ultimatum, because the energy and the performance and the confidence and the unity was all there. But obviously Forest were poor. So I think that a loss to Forest or a draw with Forest wouldn't really have altered a great deal. But the starting premise heading into 3 fixtures, Forest, Bournemouth, Palace, was to get at least 2 wins from that game. Otherwise, those games, I should say, otherwise Brendan Rodgers would be in big, big trouble. So we have to wait and see now. But I think that there's nothing in the short term, because of how good that win was against Forest, to suggest, one, that Leicester won't pick up points against Bournemouth and Crystal Palace, and then even Leeds and Wolves after that are very winnable games. But 2, whatever happens now, because of that win, I think that Brendan Rodgers has probably bought a bit more time.
JC says, I want to thank Ben for not getting sick of us during the whole takeover shenanigans. He took more than his fair share of abuse from our fan base, and he is a proper gent. JC from Vietnam.
Appreciate that, and really kind words. As I've always said, the Newcastle fan base were never in any way particularly tiresome to me or irritating to me. On social media, you don't get a reflection of the fan base at all. What you get is a lot of passionate people that are quite rightly entitled to say their piece. And as we find as journalists, not just with the takeover, but generally, when the news you bring is good, you're the best journalist in the world. You're tier 1. And when the news you bring is bad, you're tier 1,000. And people don't always want balance or the full picture. And everyone's entitled to their own opinions. And I think when the takeover was so secretive and there was so much conflicting information out there, naturally everyone was entitled to read what they want and listen to what they want and make up their own opinions. And I, like everyone else, reported on it, just tried to get to the bottom of it and give you as much balance as possible. So I appreciate the kind words. And I think one thing I always try and do is use my own platforms to be as open as I can, as detailed as I can, in addition to any writing and broadcasting that I do. And then there's always that desire on my part, where I can anyway, to directly engage, which is why I come on here, which is why I try and reply as often as I can. And I think as well, you try and be a serious journalist, but you've also got to have a sense of humor. And those two things are possible on social media. You can report something in detail and you can have a laugh at the same time, because it's always important to kind of smile and to, where possible, have a sense of humor when you come to work every single day. So there was never any sickness at my point with the fan base. Of course, you get individual trolls, and of course, you get people that aren't trolls that just disagree with you. But you have to respect that, because when you're dealing with a fan base, it's very paradoxical, because there'll be things I know as a journalist that you don't, on and off record. There'll be things that I'm given that I don't even use, because a lot of journalism is about when to use your information, but sometimes you'll get something and it's not worth using it because you want to protect that relationship with the source. So that gives me a perspective that the fan base don't have. But then the fan base have got a perspective that I don't have, because they've got their own local contacts, they've got their own perspective. You're watching the team day in, day out. You're far more understanding of the club, the culture, the city, the players, the dynamics. And there's plenty of people in Newcastle that will have their own sources through whatever means as well. And I respect that. And you can't buy that local connection. So if as a journalist, whether you're a Northeast journalist or whether you're a global journalist, you undermine the fan base, attack the fan base, have an agenda against the fan base or the football club, not only are you not providing balance, but you're missing a trick, because there's so much information and respect, by the way, within that local community of which the fan base are a part and the football club. So you have to balance that, and you have to try and navigate that. And it is going to cause friction and difference of opinion with everything. I think it's a bit straighter with the transfer, because people accept as fans 90% of the time that if I'm making it my business to dig on a player, then I'm probably putting more time and energy than most of the fan base into that. So as I build trust and credibility, then when I report, if it's good or bad news, I think people decide that they believe that, because I've hopefully built a track record. But with the takeover and it being more secretive, it very much became about us and them, and perhaps in some people's eyes, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. But I'll say what I've always said, which is that there is a huge respect for the passion and the knowledge of the Newcastle United fan base at large. And my impression during the takeover was always that the vast majority on and off social media were extremely engaged and clued up and respectful. And whether we agreed or disagreed, I enjoyed those interactions, because it's a part of what journalism should be about. And if you're not open and honest as a journalist and prepared to defend your sources and your position, then you're shying away from the story and a point of engagement. And the ones that attack me, some of them have been good enough. If they now believe that that was undue or unjust, some of them have come back and have said, we were in the wrong, or we hated you to begin with and now we really like you. And that's great. Others have still got the same opinion of me. And that's great as well, because if I come on here and I give that full context where you've not got character limits and you still don't like me, how you could not like this jumper beggars belief. But if you don't like me, then fine, because I've presented my information. I'm given that platform to do so, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. And then with the trolls, it's not just Newcastle. You get that every day from every kind of fan base. And it's unfortunate, but you learn just to ignore them.
Jacob, I wouldn't hazard a guess. That's one of those things we'll never know, mate. He said a lot, though, and a lot of it has been common sense. That's why I like to have Ben on each week. Isaac says, hey, fellas, love the show. Ben, you heard some reservations about Botman before he signed for Newcastle. What do you make of his start? I think he's quietly gone about his business, developing into a Premier League player.
Yeah, I think the reservations around Botman were whether he could repeat his form and his potential quickly enough at Premier League level. And a number of clubs that actually had European football were concerned that he would get caught out running backwards and his decision making at pace wouldn't be as strong or as intelligent. And I think the defense of Botman is that he's 22. So a lot of that criticism will perhaps be learnt. And yes, it's tough to learn on the job in the Premier League compared to other leagues, but for me, he's done okay. He's not set the world on fire, and there's a lot of competition in that position, but he's played in 6 Premier League games now, and I think that I've been impressed by actually the composure, which was one of the question marks at Premier League pace. I think that I would like to maybe see him on the ball, be a little bit more direct. And I think that it's going to take him a bit more time to kind of learn to play alongside others in-house system. But if you're judging him only on what he's done when he's been threatened defensively, I think he's shown decent maturity and composure. I think that he's been strong in any aerial duels. So maybe there's a bit more development on the ball to be a bit more direct and a bit more positive. And maybe that decision-making in that context, in terms of speed of thought, can be a little bit quicker as well. But generally speaking, when you consider his age and that he's joined a new club and that Newcastle are going to need to give him a bit more time, I think he's done okay. I think he's lived up to his potential. He's not carrying some insane price tag, which is good. You know, if you'd have signed him for double the 35 million euros, then you're suddenly like Fofana at Chelsea carrying that, and there's maybe an expectation of more. But he's been quite unsung. He's been pretty consistent, and he's only going to go from strength to strength. So I'm pretty impressed with him so far. I don't think he's done too much wrong. There's clear areas for improvement, but he's proving to be a good signing so far for Newcastle.
Last thing to discuss today, Callum Wilson, new contract, mate. A little clause in his contract meant he got an extension. It's good news, I think, for us. And talk of potentially going into a coaching role at some point. I get the feeling that Eddie certainly has roles like that in mind for maybe Matt Ritchie and Callum Wilson, of course, 2 players who, you know, were at Bournemouth with him for a considerable period as well. But yeah, look, great to see him back, you know, on the goal scoring, you know, run as well. I mean, he's had a great start to the season, just that niggling injury, which has affected it. But if we could get, you know, maybe 10, 15 games out of Wilson, our season could be a lot different.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that Howe knows the player really well, and Newcastle fans know how pivotal he is. And he's 30, of course, but you still are going to get minimum 2 good years out of him, if not slightly longer. And that's part of the extension. It's a 2-year contract extension. It keeps him at the club until 2026. And at the same time, Newcastle's strategy, as we have seen now with Isaac, but also when they tried for Ekitike and players like Mudryk and Maddison all fall into this category. They're looking to buy young, and they're looking to be patient with the caliber of player that they're trying to get. So it's not only going to be about the finished product. And that is faith in what Newcastle have currently got. And specifically, if you look at strikers, in Callum Wilson, when he is fit, when he is firing, he is going to get Newcastle goals that will propel them somewhere close to European football. And Eddie Howe knows that. And there's a huge amount of trust in Wilson, not just as a goal scorer, but as a team player and as a dressing room influence. And that's why I think once he surpasses that age where he's either integral to Newcastle or he's part of the Newcastle United setup, he will go into a coaching capacity as well. And that is something that Wilson wants to learn. And who better than from Eddie Howe because of their personal relationship. So these talks have been ongoing all summer, and there's been a clause that's been triggered in the original deal, which was only due to run until 2024. And that's what prompted the 2-year contract extension. So it's good news all round. It makes a ton of sense. And I think that Wilson is just the perfect player for Newcastle, because right now, when fit, red hot, scores goals, but personality-wise, he wants to be part of the project. So if in 2 years or even longer, his game time is reduced or somebody else comes in that does supplant him in the pecking order, he's not the kind of player that's unhappy. He sees his future as being at Newcastle United, even potentially longer than the 2 years, and as he looks to life after football. And obviously with Newcastle investing in Howe and investing in Wilson until 2026, it's just part of a longer strategic plan. And you will see Wilson, I think, mentoring younger players, being part of the, whether it's officially or unofficial, coaching and learning of younger players, so Newcastle can start to provide these pathways. And as I've said before, without banging on about it, because Newcastle don't yet have the multi-club model, they have to do that within their first team setup, which is why players like Wilson, even if it's in an unofficial capacity, are so important to help the younger players develop and eventually gain the first team football, because they've not just got these feeder clubs. Like, they'll have relationships, of course, but they've not got the formal feeder clubs that they can just pass players out to. So development has to come within a first team capacity, which is absolutely important. And we need to leave it there because I have to get the doorbell.
I will have to go. Take care, Ben. Thanks very much for joining us. Take care, mate. Bye-bye.
All the best. Cheers. Bye.